Before the snow fell at Towton, England had already been sinking into a long, quiet winter. Not the winter of weather, but a winter of power. A kingdom divided not by foreign invasion, but by its own blood. In the middle of the 15th century, England lived under King Henry VI, a gentleman, deeply pious, soft-spoken, and utterly unfit for a kingdom that required a hard hand. He suffered long periods of mental collapse, moments when he could not speak, could not stand, could barely recognize the world around him. During these absences, England did what kingdoms do when the throne is empty. It began to fracture. Nobles gathered power, old rivalries resurfaced, and in the vacuum around the weak king, two branches of the royal bloodline began circling each other like wolves. House of Lancaster, marked by the red rose, House of York, marked by the white. What started as political tension slowly became a question whispered across taverns, castles and villages. Who should truly rule England? Into this uncertainty stepped Richard, Duke of York, ambitious, capable and, crucially, possessing a strong claim to the throne. He was popular among many nobles, respected by soldiers and feared by his enemies. When Henry VI fell into long catatonia in 1453, York effectively ruled in his place. But Queen Margaret of Anjou, fiery, intelligent, fiercely protective, would not allow York to overshadow her husband or her son, Prince Edward. What began as tense rivalry turned into open hostility. What began as political disagreement turned into war. Skirmishes erupted. Retaliations followed. Regions began choosing sides. Yorkist and Lancastrian banners flew from opposing hills, sometimes only a few miles apart. Neighbours became enemies. Cousins killed cousins. Old alliances shifted with the winter wind. The conflict came to be known as the Wars of the Roses. But for those who lived through it, there was no romance in the name, only fear, hunger and uncertainty. Battles at St Albans, Blore Heath, Northampton and Wakefield shook the country. At Wakefield, Richard of York, the man who nearly became king, was killed and displayed after death as a warning to all Yorkists. But the warning failed, because Richard had a son, a tall, charismatic, almost impossibly self-assured young man, Edward, Earl of March. At just 18, he took up his father's cause with a force that startled even his allies. In early 61, Edward marched into London, victorious from multiple battles. The city welcomed him. Merchants, exhausted by years of instability, preferred a decisive Yorkist king over a drifting government led by Henry VI. And so, amidst cheers and desperation, Edward was declared King Edward IV. Uncrowned, untested, but chosen. Yet crowning oneself in London and keeping a crown in England were very different things. Margaret of Anjou and her Lancastrian lords still held enormous power in the north. They rallied under a simple truth. If they defeated Edward in open battle, the Yorkist claim would die with him. Edward understood this. He was young, but not naive. To secure his crown, he needed one thing: a decisive victory. A victory that shattered Lancastrian strength so completely that no one could question who ruled England. This victory would require marching into the cold north, into Lancastrian territory, into the heart of resistance, toward a field that would soon be remembered for the silence that followed the screaming. The winter of 1461 was among the harshest in living memory. Chroniclers describe fields solid as iron, rivers frozen over, and roads so slick that horses slipped even at a walk. Edward's men marched regardless, their breath hanging like ghosts in the morning air, their boots crunching over frost, their armour biting into their skin. Some wrapped their hands in rags. Some marched barefoot after their old shoes stiffened and split. Lancastrian forces, too, trudged through the same unforgiving land, gathering near York, prepared to defend the north with everything they had left. England was not marching toward a battle. It was marching toward a reckoning. And all roads through snow, hunger, cold and fear were converging on a single place, Towton, a quiet field in Yorkshire that would soon become the deadliest day in English history. As Edward IV claimed his crown in London, the north of England stirred like a wounded animal. Lands loyal to Lancaster felt the weight of a decade of war. Burned manor houses, seized harvests, neighbours lost to raids, ambushes, and loyalties gone wrong. But they also felt something else, a sense of ownership. This was their land. York might have taken the throne in the south, but the north, the valleys, the villages, the old estates, still beat with a Lancastrian heart. And they were not ready to surrender it to an 18-year-old king. Lancastrian nobles began summoning men across Yorkshire, experienced fighters hardened by border conflicts, levies familiar with the cold, old retainers who had served the house for generations. If London belonged to York, then Yorkshire would be the fortress of Lancaster. But Edward knew this. That's why he marched north. What history sometimes forgets is that Towton wasn't a sudden eruption. It was the final collapse of weeks of manoeuvres, ambushes, and bloodshed. Two events the day before Towton helped shape everything that came after. Ferrybridge, 28th March 1461. Edward needed to cross the River Aire to confront the Lancastrians. The bridge at Ferrybridge was the only viable crossing for an army this size. But the Lancastrians got there first. They burned parts of the bridge. They set ambushes in the early morning fog. Yorkist forces tried to cross, but were hit hard. Arrows, billmen, chaos. For hours, the bridge changed hands in brutal, messy fighting. Men fell into the freezing river and were swept under by the current. This wasn't a battle. It was a warning. Lancaster would not give Edward a clean path to Towton. Later that same day, while Edward repaired Ferrybridge and forced his way across, another Lancaster contingent, led by the feared Lord Clifford, tried to circle around and strike the Yorkist rear. But Yorkist scouts found him first. At Dintingdale, in a fast and deadly clash, Clifford was killed. His death sent a shiver through Lancastrian morale. Clifford was not just a lord, he was a symbol of their cause, the man who had slain Edward's father at Wakefield. With Clifford dead and Ferrybridge taken, the Yorkists were now fully across the Aire. They had a clear road north. But that road was steep, snowy, and soaked in the blood of the previous day. This mattered, because by the time both armies reached Towton, they were already exhausted. The night before Towton, Edward's army marched through blowing snow toward a ridge near the village of Saxton. No one slept comfortably. No fires were allowed. Firelight meant vulnerability. Horses stamped their hooves in the dark. Armour grew stiff as frost crawled up its plates. Breaths turned to mist and drifted into the night air like tiny souls escaping. Meanwhile, the Lancastrians, already positioned near Towton, rested on the higher ground. Their scouts watched the Yorkist approach. Their shapes glimpsed between sheets of snow. Imagine the sound. Nothing. Only the wind scraping across the frozen fields, rattling frozen branches, echoing in the hollows like a warning. Towton was not chosen for symbolic reasons. It was chosen because the land itself forced the confrontation. A broad plateau, few escape routes, steep drops toward Cock Beck on one side, open, exposed ground on the other. Neither army could bypass the other. Neither could retreat without being cut to pieces. The geography demanded a decisive battle, and both sides knew the victor would rule England, the loser would be ruined. This wasn't a battle fought for honour or pride, it was fought for survival. As the first pale light seeped over the horizon, two armies, tens of thousands strong, faced each other across a snowy field. Yorkists on the lower ground, Lancastrians on the ridge. A storm whipping from the southwest. Visibility almost nothing. Cold enough that the breath stung. Cold enough that skin cracked. Cold enough that the dead froze before they fell. And in that moment, before the arrows flew, before steel met bone, before England reshaped itself, there is a silence that history can still hear. The silence before Towton. The morning of 29th March 1461 did not rise gently. It came with a blizzard, a curtain of white that erased the horizon and softened the shapes of living men into moving shadows. Yorkist soldiers looked upward and could not see the sky. Lancastrian soldiers looked downward and could barely see their own boots. The snow came sideways, driven by a brutal southwesterly wind that cut through armour like needles. On the Yorkist side, men huddled behind their shields and pulled cloaks tighter, not out of fear, but simply to breathe. On the Lancastrian ridge, the wind slammed into their faces like an open palm. The storm was not a backdrop, it was a character, a weapon, a force that would shape every decision that followed. As the storm raged, both armies formed their lines. Lancastrian deployment, higher ground. They held the ridge near Towton village. Centre, mixed infantry, billmen and spearmen. Left and right wings, archers deployed forward. Rear, reserves and mounted nobles. Command, Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Their strength, higher ground, numbers, defensive posture. Their weakness, the wind. Yorkist deployment, lower ground. Edward IV formed his men on slightly lower terrain. Centre, Edward and Warwick. Right, waiting for Norfolk, not yet present. Archers, commanded by Lord Fauconberg. Reserves, held tight due to exhaustion from Ferrybridge. Their strength, leadership, discipline, the wind behind them. Their weakness, lower ground, fatigued troops. The two armies stood perhaps 200 to 300 metres apart, just close enough to make out the dark line of the enemy. Between them, a void filled with blowing snow. In wars of this age, victory often belonged to the side that best understood the ground. But today, the ground meant nothing. The wind was everything. Lord Fauconberg, commanding the Yorkist archers, noticed something critical. The storm was blowing toward the Lancastrians. Snowflakes, ice, breath and sound all moved in one direction, from York toward Lancaster. He raised his hand, a simple gesture, barely visible, but it began one of the most tactically brilliant openings in medieval English warfare. Fauconberg ordered his archers to advance 10 to 15 paces to what they knew as maximum longbow range. Snow stung their eyes, bowstrings grew stiff, but they drew anyway. The first volley was not meant to kill, it was meant to measure. Thousands of arrows left the Yorkist line in a dark, rippling wave, momentarily clear before being swallowed by the blizzard. The wind caught them, carried them, drove them farther than expected. On the Lancastrian ridge, they struck armour, shields, flesh. Some snapped on impact. Some embedded themselves so deeply that men fell without understanding where the shot had come from. The test had worked. The Lancastrian archers, angered and surprised, stepped forward and loosed a counter-volley. Their arrows vanished into the storm and then fell short, dozens of yards short. They struck the snow harmlessly, hissing into drifts, skipping off ice, skittering along the ground. A murmur spread through the Lancastrian ranks. Warriors quickly realized the truth. The wind was stealing their strength. They fired again and again. Arrows fell short every time. Thousands of shafts, expensive and precious, wasted at their feet. Fauconberg saw it instantly. He ordered his men to advance a few steps, collect the fresh, unused arrows that had fallen short, and fire them back. Imagine the sight. Yorkist archers kneeling calmly in the snow, plucking enemy arrows from the ground as if gathering sticks for a fire, then rising as one to send them screaming back uphill. Now every arrow struck true. Archer lines on the ridge shuddered. Men lifted shields too late. Screams cut through the wind. Snow turned pink in small, widening patches. Caught in the storm, their arrows useless, their armour battered, Lancastrian commanders realised they had only one option. Close the distance, force melee, break the Yorkist line in hand-to-hand battle. Archers were ordered to retreat behind infantry. Infantry were ordered to advance downhill. This moment is crucial. The Lancastrians did not charge because they wanted to. They charged because they had to. Standing still meant death by arrows they could not return. So the order echoed through the line. Forward! Up on the ridge, shadows began to move. Thousands of men descending into the white void. And on the Yorkist side, Edward, Warwick and Fauconberg braced themselves. Because this was the moment they had prepared for. The storm had done its part. Now steel would do the rest. The Lancastrians came down the ridge like a dark wave, shields up, billhooks raised, boots slipping in the half-frozen mud. On the Yorkist side, men tightened their ranks. Some whispered prayers, some said nothing at all. Snow clung to armour, cloaks, beards. Every man looked like a statue of ice. Then the two lines met. Not with elegance, not with heroic cries, but with a sound that witnesses compared to smiths beating iron. A low, grinding, terrible rhythm. Steel on steel, steel on bone, steel on frozen earth. The battle became a single, sprawling organism, shifting and buckling under its own weight. This was not open-field cavalry charges or clean duel lines. Towton was fought in clotted snow, mud and blindness. The weapons tell the story. Billhooks. Lancastrian soldiers favoured the bill, a farming tool reshaped into war. It could hook armour, trip a man, tear him down into the mud before the final thrust. Poleaxes. Yorkist men-at-arms fought with poleaxes, heavy, square-headed, designed to smash plate armour. One good blow could crush a helmet inward. Swords and daggers. Only used once polearms became too tangled. At Towton, men were pressed so tightly that many could only stab blindly at shapes inches in front of them. Shields and bodies. Men used corpses as barriers. They braced feet against frozen limbs to push forward even a few inches. This is why the battle lasted so long. It wasn't manoeuvre warfare. It was two walls of humanity trying to grind the other into nothing. Historians estimate the melee may have lasted 6 to 10 hours. Hours where arms went numb, fingers lost feeling, swords slipped from frozen hands, men's breaths turned to steam, armour frosted over, snow turned grey, then pink, then red. Snowfall varied throughout the day, sometimes thick enough that the world disappeared, sometimes thinning just long enough for fighters to see shadows moving in front of them. The rhythm of the battle followed the rhythm of exhaustion. Lines pushed forward, then stalled, then pushed again, as if the entire field were breathing. Despite the storm, leadership mattered. Edward IV, tall, broad-shouldered, barely 19, but already a veteran. He fought near the front ranks, an anchor for collapsing morale. Men later said that simply seeing him kept them from turning away. Earl of Warwick, bloodied from Ferrybridge, his armour dented, but still riding along the line to shout orders, raise fallen banners, and pull men back into the fight when fatigue made them falter. Somerset, Lancastrian, trying desperately to use his numbers before Yorkist reinforcements arrived. He pressed the Yorkist centre again and again, hoping for a crack. Sir Andrew Trollope, a feared veteran, killed during the fighting. His death was not symbolic, it had real tactical cost. Lancastrian discipline faltered without his grounding presence. As the hours passed, the ground changed. The first layer was snow, the second layer was mud, the third layer was bodies. So many that chroniclers described soldiers fighting on top of corpses, losing their footing as if walking on uneven shifting stones. Men slipped, fell into gore-soaked slush, and were trampled before they could rise. Others were dragged down by opponents grabbing their ankles from beneath. Towton was not only violent, it was slow, grinding, thick with resistance. A battle fought not only against the enemy, but against the weight of the dead. By early afternoon, the Yorkist forces, exhausted, freezing, fighting uphill, began to bend. Some groups fell back several paces. A few men broke and fled the line before being dragged back or struck down. Warwick shouted. Edward waded into the front. But the truth was undeniable. The Yorkist centre was on the edge of collapsing. Somerset knew it. He sensed the shift. He ordered more pressure, more weight, more bodies into the line to finish the job. For a moment, a long, terrifying moment, it seemed the Lancastrians might grind the Yorkists into the snow. The blizzard muted the world. Sound vanished. Vision collapsed. Only one thing could change the course of the bloodiest battle in English history. Reinforcements. And they were coming. Just not for Lancaster. By mid-afternoon, the Yorkist army was close to breaking. Their centre, pushed for hours, leaned backward like a bow under strain. Men slipped on blood-soaked mud. Shields hung low. Arms trembled. Lancastrian pressure was relentless. Somerset kept feeding more men into the grinding melee, trying to end the war before nightfall. And then, through the curtain of snow on the Yorkist right flank, a new shape appeared. At first, it was only a darker blur against the white horizon. Then came bammers, billmen, shadows resolving into spears. Norfolk had arrived, fresh troops, unexhausted, untouched by 10 hours of carnage. It was the moment Edward had been desperately waiting for. The Duke of Norfolk angled his men not straight ahead, but diagonally into the exposed Lancastrian left flank. A perfect, crushing angle. Lancastrian soldiers, already blinded by wind and exhaustion, did not see them until they were almost on top of them. Yorkist horns cut through the storm, a deep, growling note, the only sound louder than the blizzard. Then came the impact. Norfolk's billmen slammed into the flank with the full weight of fresh legs, fresh morale, and strategic surprise. The Lancastrian left buckled instantly. A ripple moved through the line, shock, fear, confusion. Some tried to turn, some tried to brace, most were simply overwhelmed. The 10 hours stalemate ended in seconds. When a medieval army breaks, it does not retreat, it disintegrates. Men stopped fighting, blades dropped, shields lowered. Panic replaced discipline. The tightly packed line turned into a churning mass of bodies struggling to escape the slaughter. What had been a battle became a rout. Lancastrian soldiers tried to pull away uphill, but slipped on frozen mud. Some were cut down where they stood. Others crushed beneath the press of men fleeing behind them. Commanders shouted orders, but in the blizzard no one heard anything. Retreat turned into raw survival. The Lancastrians fled northeast toward the narrow crossing over Cock Beck. It was the only path that offered a chance of escape. But the ground dipped sharply, and panic made everything worse. Men tripped on bodies, slid down the incline, fell into the icy water. Cock Beck in March is freezing, fast and deeper than its quiet surface suggests. Those who tumbled in while wearing armour stood almost no chance. They sank instantly under the weight of steel. Witnesses later wrote that men tried to climb out using the bodies of their comrades as stepping stones. A line from a chronicler survives: "The living fled across the dead." The low ground south of the Beck became known as Bloody Meadow. Here the Yorkist pursuit was at its most merciless, not because of cruelty, but because of fear. If any Lancastrians escaped, Edward's crown might not survive the year. Yorkist soldiers cut down fleeing men as the snow swallowed sound and breath. Those who reached the Beck faced a choice: try to cross and risk drowning, turn and fight and surely die. Both choices ended the same way. Bodies clogged the stream until the water ran dark. Some men crossed the Beck only by crawling over a bridge made of corpses. No image from Towton captures the day better than that. A bridge of the dead, carrying the living for one last moment. By the time the last Lancastrians fled toward Tadcaster, Towton Field had fallen silent. No horns, no shouts, just the blizzard and the moaning wind moving across thousands of still shapes half buried in snow. Edward IV had won, not by luck, but by endurance, terrain, wind, and the perfectly timed arrival of Norfolk's flank. The battle was over. The slaughter was not. The snow continued to fall until it covered the dead in a quiet, cold shroud. England would wake the next day with a new king and a field that would never be fully remembered nor fully forgotten. The morning after Towton was colder than the day before. The storm had calmed, but the battlefield remained white, not because of fresh snow, but because snow covered the dead. Thousands of bodies lay frozen where they had fallen. Some curled into themselves, some reaching forward as if still fighting, some half submerged in drifts that made them look like sleeping men. The silence was absolute. Not the peaceful silence of winter, but the hollow quiet that follows a day of unimaginable violence. A kingdom had been reshaped in the space of a single afternoon. Edward, now 19 years old, stood victorious. But victory did not feel triumphant. He had secured his crown, yes, but he had done so at the cost of rivers clogged with corpses, at the cost of thousands of Englishmen lying dead on English soil. Lancastrian leadership shattered. Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled north towards Scotland. Key nobles were dead or in hiding. their armies scattered, broken beyond repair. Towton was not just a victory, it was a statement. Edward IV ruled England now, by right of blood, by right of force, by right of the dead. Few aspects of Towton are as grim or as revealing as what happened in the days that followed. The fallen were far too many to bury individually, so Yorkist soldiers, local villagers and labourers, working under freezing conditions, dragged bodies into mass graves. Large pits were carved into the hard earth using picks, axes and sheer strength. Dozens of men were lowered at a time, stacked in layers of cloth, steel and frozen flesh. At least one major grave, found in the 1990s, revealed horrifying details. Multiple blunt force trauma to skulls. Deep sword cuts, often from behind. Many men were young adults, veterans of years of conflict. Some had healing wounds, proof that this was not their first battle. Several skulls showed multiple killing blows, suggesting execution or rout phase slaughter. The bones formed a narrative that words alone cannot convey. Towton was fought face to face, inch by inch, and ended in desperation. For years, perhaps decades, locals avoided the field. Farmers claimed that ploughing in early spring would sometimes turn up bits of mail, broken arrowheads, or even bones. Children were warned not to wander toward the beck. It was said the water remembered too much. Even into the 19th century, visitors wrote that the wind seemed different on Towton Field, colder, emptier, as if carrying echoes from a day when tens of thousands struggled and died in a blizzard of steel. Modern excavations transform Towton from a legend into a palpable reality. At Towton Hall, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing several dozen skeletons. Damage patterns showed that many blows came from above, meaning the victims were likely on their knees or even prone when struck. Other findings included arrowheads from English longbows, fragments of armour, bone deformities from long years of marching, healed injuries from earlier battles, crushed vertebrae indicating men trampled under weight of retreating troops. The battlefield told the truth that chronicles softened. Towton was not just the bloodiest battle in English history, it was one of the most intimate. Men died in close contact, in snow thick enough to muffle screams, in mud soaked enough to suffocate. Towton ended the first act of the Wars of the Roses. Edward IV secured his reign. Lancaster's military power was destroyed. The political map was rewritten. But history rarely moves cleanly. Within a decade, war would rise again. New betrayals, new battles, new winter mornings. Towton did not end the conflict. It only set the stage for everything that followed. Barnet, Tewkesbury, Bosworth, the rise of the Tudors. A century of dynastic ambition was compressed into a single frozen moment on a Yorkshire field. If you visit Towton now, you will find nothing spectacular. Just quiet grasslands, gentle slopes, and the whispering sound of wind over open ground. No monuments of stone, no towering statues. Only the earth itself, holding the memory. Close your eyes, and you may hear the muffled crunch of snow, the distant murmur of voices. the imagined thud of arrows cutting through a wind. Or maybe you will hear nothing at all, because the deepest stories are the ones the land no longer speaks, only remembers. Towton, 1461. Winter remembers everything.